He was a scientific pilot, and he pioneered that whole concept, and that's what we have today. Our pilots are all very disciplined. That whole idea of the Chuck Yeager barnstormer pilot went away pretty much with Eddie Allen. And so one of the first things he did at Boeing was establish an in-house flight test and flight research program, and that's this picture here. So this was one of a kind. This is the very beginning of that whole idea. Again, Eddie Allen typically would go as a contractor from company to company just to fly their airplane, but here he was to stay. He started a program, and this was something new in the entire industry. And so his mark on aviation history was he transformed that role of the test pilot. And these are his words. A prototype of the test pilot, according to the usual history told by fiction writers and motion picture producers, is a daredevil sort of fellow, not infrequently long on courage and short on brains, who takes up a newly designed ship, whips it through the air a few times, then goes into a vertical dive that ends up in a 9G pullout. If the wings don't fold up, the ship is pronounced safe. Actually, flight testing today is not a spasmodic, haphazard, daredevil occupation. For some years, it has been a sound scientific business operation continuously to perform a design function on a quantitative basis. And so he came up with that concept of doing the scientific flight testing program. And one of his most important roles at Boeing, so he actually came to Boeing right after there was a famous accident with the 307 Stratoliner. And that airplane went out for a flight test with some KLM pilots who said, you know, how will the plane fly with just two engines out on one side? And that didn't work out real well. So Callistra, our test pilot, the whole 10 people on board were killed in that. So that's when Eddie was hired. But his most important role, and what he's remembered for the most after flying the 314 and the B-17, was flying this airplane, the B-29. He was the chief test pilot, and the B-29 was the most important program in World War II. It was most technologically advanced program. And think about this, that this whole concept of the heavy bomber, strategic air power was brand new. Head of the Air Force, Hap Arnold, he says, we need a super bomber. And Boeing, you need to hurry up and get that done. Day after Pearl Harbor, called up Boeing and said, where's that super bomber? Well, it was still on the drawing board. And so here it is, just not even 2 years later, making its first flight. Really impressive that they pushed this from design into flight testing. But the airplane, because of this, the urgency of the war, the airplane was concurrently in design, flight test, and production, because they got it right into production as soon as they could. So there were a lot of bugs to work out of this airplane, and based on the things that you hear, you know, how things work today, this would not have been accepted at all, what this airplane went through. Because for one thing, the engines overheated. That became the end of the XB-29. I'll talk about that. But they had some major problems pushing this technology. But it was an incredibly advanced airplane. And we'll talk about a little bit more about aerodynamics and where that came from. But the airfoil, they had that very long, narrow airfoil with really heavy loading on it that was just a heresy at the time. I think it had about 70 pounds per square foot. And usually I think, you know, like B-17 is like 17 to 20, and that's what was acceptable. So this airplane was very, very innovative. So very important. Eddie had a big job flying that. And one of the other things that Eddie Allen was able to do because of his reputation, he went right to the top of the company, to this gentleman, Phil Johnson, who was the CEO, a brilliant leader who had come up with Bill Boeing. He was hired right at the beginning of the company out of the University of Washington. Bill Boeing had a great eye for talent, and Johnson really proved that. He came in as a young engineer, made it up through the ranks of the company, and when Boeing started his big corporation, United Aircraft, Johnson was made the CEO of all the airline operations. And so essentially you could say he was the first CEO of United Airlines. When that was all broken up in 1934, when the Roosevelt administration kind of frowned on the airplane business, Johnson couldn't stay in the business, and so he left, went to Canada for a couple years, helped start Air Canada. He couldn't sit still. He did that, and then he came back 5 years later, he could come back and start working in the airplane business again, and came back to Boeing in 1939 and was made the CEO of the company, the president. One of his greatest, he was brilliant, great leader, and one of the things that he really helped with is he had a great understanding of how to produce airplanes. And this whole concept of how do we go from building a dozen airplanes at a time to building hundreds and thousands for the war effort, he knew how to do that. He was one of the architects of that effort, the arsenal of democracy. And so he was just brilliant. So anyway, Eddie Allen goes to Phil Johnson, and this is at a time, 1941, the company hasn't had a lot of sales, finally getting a few because of the war in Europe. There's a few contracts, but the company's not doing too well. There's not a lot of money, and he tells Phil Johnson, he says, you need to build a wind tunnel. And it's going to be $1 million. And at that time, that was a lot of money. And it was like, why do we need a wind tunnel? And fortunately, Phil Johnson he listened to Eddie Allen, who told him, and the only wind tunnels we have are the ones that are operated by the universities. The University of Washington had a great tunnel that Boeing used a lot. Guggenheim had tunnels around the country, in particular in California, at Galset, at the Caltech, and that was used a lot. But you had Douglas, North American, Lockheed, and Boeing all competing for time. And with the war ramping up and new airplanes being designed, the testing was so important that they just couldn't do it. And so this is what Allen told Johnson. He said, this is why we need our own tunnel. And so Johnson agreed, brilliant leader. And he did that, and just the day before Pearl Harbor, he signed the order, say, go ahead and do it. If this discussion had happened, imagine just a couple weeks later, they would have said, I don't know if we can spend that kind of money now, we're in a war. So, again, serendipity. So they set forward to design the tunnel, and Boeing had a couple of brilliant engineers, in particular Bill Cook, who was given charge of that. Just a brilliant, brilliant gentleman. And a young Bob Withington was his assistant. Bob would later be the head of Boeing's SST program, supersonic transport. He was another just brilliant engineer. So like I said, they had to rely on these other tunnels and wanted to have somebody do continuous testing and that. And Lockheed had realized this, and so Lockheed had built a tunnel, and the Boeing folks went down and took a look at it. And Lockheed's tunnel, it had a limit of about 300 miles an hour. And so it was great for the airplanes of the day. But when the team got back to Seattle, they were starting to think that maybe we need to do something a little better. And one thing that really turned it around is that as a consultant, they hired Theodore von Karman, who was the brilliant aerodynamicist at Caltech. He went on to start headed up the Jet Propulsion Laboratory later on. And von Karman told him, he says, and he might have had some idea that jets were coming around because of what was going on with Whittle in England and von Hohenheim in Germany. He might have had some idea that was happening, but he told the Boeing folks, he says, you need to make that tunnel so that it can test up to Mach 0.9, so about 625 miles an hour. Nothing was flying that fast, but they said, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Again, just brilliant. Some people say it was a hunch, but I think von Karman was really in tune with what was going on. So here's the construction of that wind tunnel. So this is at Boeing Field, and it was right next to the old plant too that got torn down. Our headquarters building is still there, and the wind tunnel is still pretty much on this location, but there's not much left of this original building. It was an 8 by 12 tunnel, a 24-foot diameter fan, huge fan, 16,000 horsepower hydroelectric engine. Thank God for Grand Coulee Dam. Boeing was very fortunate to have, as we still are, to have hydroelectric power to run that. So Eddie Allen brilliantly set Boeing on this path, and sadly, we lost him not long after this. So the tunnel is started March 43, and even though that says December on there, ignore that. That's when the picture was taken. In February 18th, 1943, the B-29, the XB-29 caught fire while Eddie was coming into Seattle. And what they had discovered later is the engine nacelles were so tight. They had worked so hard to streamline the airplane. Basically, what they wanted out of the B-29 was to have an airplane that had the same amount, that had half the drag of the B-17, but an airplane that was almost twice the size. That was their goal, and they accomplished it. But one of the things they did is they packed those engines so tight into that cowling that it overheated. And in this case, there was a fuel leak in the back against the firewall, and because of the heat, it caught fire. And that fuel that had been leaking through the leading edge had actually gone into the bomb bay, and so that fire quickly spread to the airplane. And then it crashed into the Fry packing plant. This is down in close to where the baseball stadiums are, the Soto district. And so they lost the airplane then, and it was a horrific tragedy for Boeing. Not just Eddie Allen this was a tragedy for America, that our greatest pilot was lost. And so if you don't mind, there's a great story here that was in Reader's Digest. I think a very dramatic story that Tom Collison wrote about this. He talks about, Eddie Allen could have stayed out of the ground and evaluated reports with other pilots, but this was not his way. Almost always, he was in the pilot's seat when the monster took off for test. He was determined to make the B-29 the plane he knew it could be. He was equally determined that no soldier or airman would needlessly lose his life when the plane reached the battlefront. "I'm coming in," Eddie said on February 18, 1943. He scheduled another test for the 29, and that day began with an overcast, but in the morning wore on, visibility increased to 5 miles, cloud ceiling 10,000 feet. Eddie and his colleagues entered the plane, ran up the engines, roared down the runway, climbed into the low shifting clouds, and it was 11 minutes past noon. 5 minutes later, the Seattle control tower heard these words from the plane: "Fire in number 1, coming in. I think we have it under control." Then there was silence for an eternity of 5 minutes. The plane spoke again. 2,400 feet, descending. Request immediate clearance for landing. Number 1 engine on fire, propeller feathered. Order crash equipment to stand by. The tower replied, "Roger, cleared to land on runway 13. The plane sliced over Seattle's business district at 1,200 feet, smoke pouring out from engine number 1. Bits of burning metal began to fall from the plane. The plane spoke to the tower. "Have fire equipment ready. I'm coming in with wing on fire." Finally, south of Boeing Field, flying south for Boeing Field, steadily losing altitude, the plane was burning like a cattail. Pieces of the de-icer system were falling. Landing gear was twisted in heated agony. Gasoline rushed to the leading edge of the wing and exploded. Flames were flashing into the cockpit, but the 2 pilots remained fiercely at their posts. Holding the plane in level altitude, with seconds to live, Eddie Allen and co-pilot Robert Dansfield pulled back on the controls in an attempt to clear building level, but the left wingtip smashed into a building, spinning the giant flaming airplane in a slow, sickening arc. A series of explosions echoed around the distant hills. I was in the Boeing factory at that time, unaware of the developing tragedy, until there came this awful cannonade. It was followed by a moment of stunned silence. Then office doors banged open. Feet began to run. Hundreds of pairs of feet ran. But not mine. I could not move. I knew with terrible certainty that I had just heard the death of my friend. Eddie Allen's work did not stop with his death. He had established criteria for heavy airplane stability, control, and flight procedures. That finally brought the B-29 to success. The B-29 brought us to victory in the Pacific. Our debt to Eddie did not end with the war, for every airliner now flying was incubated from those wartime bombers. Whenever I take a flight, jet-propelled and silky smooth, I seem to see his face before me. He watches as I settle myself deeply in the upholstered seat, as I am swept aloft to be catapulted through the skies at 570 miles an hour. Then he gives me a bemused smile as if to say, "Isn't it surprising what you can accomplish if you're only willing to cut and try?" So that was the loss of Eddie Allen, a tremendous loss. So 2 months later, in a ceremony that included, this is a picture that really kind of, something that really tugged at me in a way that I wanted to tell this bigger story about Eddie Allen, because this is the ceremony of starting up the wind tunnel that he had asked Boeing to build. That's his wife, his widow, Florence, and George Shire, our chief aerodynamicist, there to start up the wind tunnel. And you can still see the pain on their faces of losing their friend, and Florence losing her husband, the father of her children. And so a tremendous tragedy for Boeing and the world. And that wind tunnel, to this day, is named in honor of Eddie Allen. The Edmund T. Allen Memorial Laboratory still has that plaque there when you go into the tunnel at Boeing. And one of the very first planes tested was modification for the B-17. Some of the work they were doing to make the G model. And this model, actually, we had it restored, and it is completely restored and refurbished and on display in our wind tunnel group at Boeing. So it's still around. Beautiful model. So that is the wind tunnel story. Very important part of this, really the beginning, the key part of this story. The next part of it, and with Eddie Allen being our first hero, the next hero, we'll go to talk about George Shire and the team that came up with our first swept-wing jet. The path that led to a swept-wing bomber. And this started in 1943 when the United States Army Air Force requested of the 5 major airplane companies that they produce a jet bomber. The jet engine was brand new, and Air Force wanted it applied to a bomber. We'd already been working on fighters with the XP-59 and the P-80, and so now it was onto the bomber. Boeing would, you'll see in here a lot that there's very conventional thinking at this time throughout, and that's the thing about World War II. Our designers during World War II were very conventional. When you look at the airplanes we put out, there wasn't a lot of changes. The B-29, of course, with that long, narrow airfoil was a huge change. I think in the Mustang, mentioned a few of those with the laminar flow wing, and the design of the air induction system, the radiator system, was really innovative. But beyond that, straight wings, and that's pretty much it. There wasn't a lot of changes. The engines, that's a whole other story. Engines accelerated quite a bit. So when we first started developing a jet bomber, very conventional. Straight wings, engines in the wings, and this is Boeing's first try at a jet bomber, the Model 424, and basically it's a B-29. And you pull off the piston engines and drop a couple jet engines into the wing. It really didn't increase the performance much, so they knew something else had to be done. At Douglas, they had actually started working on hardware and came up with the XB-43 that was a modification of the propeller-driven XB-42. So this is America's first jet bomber. They built 2 of them. It didn't go into production, but it was a great airplane for testing. They actually did a lot of work in giving feedback to GE on that TG-180 engine that became the J-47. I think there was several hundred points that Douglas had discovered that helped GE to improve that engine. So it was very important in that regard. Next, North American had actually been working on the idea of a jet bomber and was ready to produce it. So the Air Force gave them a go-ahead with the B-45. So that was America's first production jet bomber. A good airplane, but again, very conventional, with the engines buried in a straight wing. And it didn't have a very successful career as a bomber, but it did have a long career as a reconnaissance airplane. It flew well into the 1950s doing strategic reconnaissance when it was retired by the Douglas RB-66. So that was the first step, America's first production bomber. And other companies continued to develop the next generation of bombers. And Boeing went on with this airplane with the Model 432. So the first idea here, you see that they are struggling with this idea of where do you put the engines. So in World War II, the way we lost most of our bombers is they would take damage in the engine, and the fire would start, the fire would spread to the wing, to the fuel tanks, take the wing off, and we lost a bomber. So that's how we lost most of our bombers. And so the Boeing designers wanted to get away from putting the engines in the wing. And when you look at how they were designing airplanes in Great Britain, they buried them in the wings, right, with the Comet and some of those other jets that they were developing, fighter jets. They bury those in the wings. So Boeing didn't want to do that. So this was a problem. Where do you put them? So they packed them around the fuselage. You can see those 4 engines on the back of the fuselage, which wasn't a good idea. And the Air Force was very quick to tell Boeing that as well. But here's that wind tunnel model for that. And one of the things to note here, though, it's a very smooth, very clean wing, and that was one of the important aspects of this too, was to have that a very smooth, clean, narrow wing. And so this is where Boeing was when something revolutionary happened. Something interesting, I should say. And what would be revolutionary? They got word of a new idea of sweeping the wings back. And at this point, they sent a note to the Air Force and said, we'd like to have a year so that we can do further research. And you imagine what the Air Force would say, right? It's like, what? But Boeing had such a great reputation that the Air Force, and they were skeptical, but they said, okay, go ahead. We want to see what you're going to come up with. And so in May 45, that information came to Boeing about the swept wing. And Boeing began an intense study on this. And so you can see here how that we've gone from that straight wing to having the wings sweep back, angled back. You could also angle them forward and get similar results. And what that does, and mind you, I'm not an aeronautical engineer, but for those of you that, okay, why swept wing? Here's the short answer. It increases the performance of the airplane by delaying the shock wave. And with that shock wave, you get aerodynamic drag increases greatly. So if you can slow that down, the plane can go faster. And so that gets you closer to the speed of sound. And that worked. So where did this come from, this idea? The swept wing came independently in a couple of places. It was here in the United States. Robert Jones, who was working at NACA, came up with the mathematics of the swept wing, and while he was doing research on missiles at the end of World War II. And this information really didn't get too far out of NACA, out of Langley. So Boeing never got to see this, but it was there. And again, this was really thinking beyond what the conventional wisdom of the time. And so that was, Jones was always remembered as a brilliant designer. But for Boeing, where the swept wing came was out of this. The scientific advisory group was started by Henry Hap Arnold, General of the Air Force, and you can see his picture up there on the left. He went to Theodore von Karman, again, the brilliant aerodynamicist, physicist, and asked him to put together a study group that would go into Germany, follow the United States Army into Germany, right behind the front lines, and as the American Army moved through Germany and took over these research centers where of course we all know the stories that Germans were working on all these incredible secret projects, jets, rockets. So their job was to follow the Army into Germany and find these areas find the scientists, find their records. And one of the first things that von Karman did was that he asked George Scheier to be part of the team. So Scheier was asked to go, and one of the other things I'll mention about Theodore von Karman, if you remember the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, that story of the bridge collapsing, the Galloping Gertie, von Karman was given the job to figure out why. He discovered the reasons, the aerodynamic reasons why the bridge collapsed. So the team was sent to Germany with, there's George Scheier, good picture of George. And so Scheier came to Boeing. Eddie Allen brought him along when they had, Eddie was down at Consolidated working with them on some of the airplanes, and that's where Scheier was. He worked with David Davis, who was the inventor of that narrow wing, the Davis wing. And so Scheier brought that knowledge to Boeing, and they created what was called the 117 airfoil that was first used on the Sea Ranger, but became famous on the B-29, the Boeing 117 airfoil. So Scheier was given this task of going to Germany and talking to these German scientists, and one of the places they went to was Wolkenreude, outside of Göttingen, near Hanover. And what's really interesting about this, it was completely intact. So this is the end of the war. American Army has passed through, the war is over, and they discover this place. It had never been touched. The Allies didn't know it was there. It was in a forest. It was covered with trees and plants. There were storks nesting on top of the building. Never touched. It was so isolated that when the Americans came in, the scientists didn't even realize that the war was over. They just kept working. They had no contact with their leadership at all, and just continued to do their research. So when Scheier arrived, that was the condition that what they discovered. So it was completely intact, just really fascinating. And so
that picture was out after the war then?
This was, I think that was early on. That's actually a picture where they were testing the 109 early on.
But it survived through into
Yeah. Gosh. It was the Hermann Göring Research Center or something to that effect. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the main scientists that Scheier was able to talk to was Adolf Busemann, and they got to talking about the swept wing, and Busemann, and I think I got it spelled right. It should be U. They were talking about how before the war they had all met in Rome in 1935. There was a conference, the Volta Conference, that had been sponsored by the head of the Italian Air Force, General Arturo Crocco. And so they all got together, and there was somebody presented this swept wing. And that was kind of the talk then about this whole concept. And then it was forgotten, except in Germany. They continued to do the research. And some of that research helped and actually got developed into airplanes. Now, the world's first operational jet fighter, the Me-262, operational in 1944. And fortunately, of course, you know the story. Fortunately for us, Hitler insisted that it be a bomber. And thank goodness, it wasn't until January of '45 that he finally listened to Adolf Galland and made it an interceptor. And if that had happened earlier, the war might have gone on for a long time, because it was a really good interceptor. It had a bit of a swept wing, 18 degrees, but that wasn't for speed. That was for stability, so for longitudinal balance. So they had. So that shows that some of the research that the Germans were doing very, very advanced. So while Scheier was in Germany and talking to Busemann and doing other research, he put together this letter and sent it back to Boeing. And the letter is hidden away at the Museum of Flight. It should be at Boeing, but that's a whole other story. But it's still intact. And in this letter, and he wrote "censored" on the envelope to get it past the American Army censors. And you can see the diagram there. He explains the swept wing, and he says, "Test this. This is what we've been looking for to make our bomber design go faster," basically. And then in this letter, it's really great. He says, "Please share this with." I think he says Ed Heinemann down at Douglas, and he mentions Lockheed and North American, because there was a spirit of cooperation. We were all working together for the war effort. So he says, share this with everybody else too. And so immediately, because of what Eddie Allen had done, with giving Boeing a high-speed wind tunnel. All these people, all this serendipity. Boeing had a high-speed wind tunnel that when Shire's letter arrived, they immediately built a model and put it to test. Rather than having to go down to Guggenheim Laboratory or the University of Washington and wait, they were able to do it immediately. And this is the very first test of a swept wing. And they also tested the forward swept wing as well. They then took that earlier model 432, they swept the wings back, it became the Boeing model 448, and they actually tested various positions for that wing, trying to figure out what was best. So this was a big concern. What's the right sweep? What degree? And there was an engineer by the name of Vic Ganser. He took out a slide rule and scratched his head, and he said, 35 degrees. And they tested that, and it worked. And what's brilliant about that, and what it shows, is that they could have spent months adjusting that and doing the research, trying to find the right angle. But because of that, just that basic knowledge, that gut knowledge, Ganser was able to take this really good guess. And as it ended up, the optimal position was 37. So he was pretty darn close. So Ganser went on to be the head of the aeronautics program at the University of Washington after that. And so generations of Boeing engineers and others were taught by Vic Ganser. Just a brilliant, brilliant teacher as well as engineer. So with that, Boeing created this model. So this is now the 448 with the swept wing. And that worked out just great. They were very satisfied with the wing. And now the next problem was where to put the engines. But I also want to talk about some developments with using that same technology. What happened down at North American, they had a very important development program as well, because just like Boeing, when they were developing their next fighter plane, a jet fighter plane, the F-86 and the FJ Fury for the Navy, it was very conventional. It was pretty much what Lockheed was doing with the P-80. And it's a very rare picture of the mock-up of the straight wing F-86. So they took that idea and they swept the wings back on the XP-86 and found out that they had a really good performing airplane there. And that solved their issues as well, making a very fast airplane, which ended up being very consequential in our next war in Korea. That's a whole nother great story. But they were very proud of this advance. They showed it on the Fury, the Navy's version of the jet. The first one, the FJ-1, the conventional airplane, that is pretty much a P-51 Mustang with the jet engine in the fuselage. And then they swept the wings back with the FJ Fury. So this North American was pretty proud of that advanced research they had done.
What increase in speed did that produce?
From the FJ-1 to the, that is a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah, it was, what was, let's see, the F-86, so one of the studies that they, well, I don't know if you know, you probably know this story, that when they were testing it, when George Welsh was doing the tests, that they were able to break the sound barrier in the XP-86, which they had to bury because the Air Force had put all of these all this investment into the X-1, and I made the mistake of bringing that up, and Chuck Yeager's wife found out about it. So I think that's one of the differences, that they were able to achieve supersonic speed in a dive. George Welsh was able to do that. So the next problem, we got the swept wing. What do you do with the engines? Again, this is the big problem. Boeing doesn't want the designers don't want the engines in the wing, and so they decided to put them on the. You can see in this picture here, you got them on the horizontal tips of the horizontal stabilizers. They put them on the tips of the wing, every place possible they were thinking, and to try to figure out what would work. And early on, they saw that in Germany they had some of the similar issues, and this is probably as close as Germany got to making a swept wing airplane with the Ju-287. They used the forward sweep and put the engines, you can see them packed against the front of the fuselage and then tucked right underneath the wings. This airplane is about the size of a B-25. And the end of the war ended all of the research on this airplane, so it didn't really have much of a chance. And it gave Boeing a chance to actually proceed with that. This is what they finally came up with, the Model 450. And this is an early model of that. And that, what made the airplane, what they discovered were potted engines. And this is the gentleman who did it. So our next hero of this story is Ed Wells. Ed Wells was the greatest engineer at Boeing. He's up there with some of the very greats. I know everybody likes Kelly Johnson, and I think Ed Wells would certainly is as good, if not better. Ed Wells came to Boeing when he was 24 years old in 1934, and he was made the assistant chief engineer on a new airplane program called the Model 299. And a year later, he was the chief engineer on that airplane, and then by the time it was called the Flying Fortress. 25 years old, he was the chief engineer and designer of the B-17. And he was the chief engineer and designer of the B-29, and he was the head of this program as well. And so just a brilliant, brilliant leader, and not just brilliant in so many other ways, just a fantastic leader, a gentleman, and he was an artist as well. And you can see it. These are Ed Wells' drawings. He was a brilliant artist. And I think it really shows that this is what I try to tell a lot of our young engineers, to really not, this whole thing about STEM is kind of a problem. It's great, learn science and technology, but what I like is what we call STEAM, where you learn art as well. And that's what Ed Wells had. He was an artist, so he could use both sides of his brain. And that was what was so important for success, is that you could visualize, not just figure out formula and problems, but you could visualize problems. And that was what Ed Wells had. So he took that really ugly airplane design with the engines packed around the back of the fuselage. It was an ugly airplane. You know, an ugly airplane, we learned that on the JSF program. Ugly airplanes don't win. And, you know, so you should know that by now. So he brought that back. And the Air Force said that you can't have those engines packed around the fuselage, because if there's a fire, it goes right to the flight deck. And so they sent, was it KB Wolf, who was the head of AMC at the time, and he pretty much sent Ed Wells packing. And so Ed Wells had some quiet time on his trip back from Dayton, coming back to Seattle, and he did these drawings. And he came up with this brilliant idea. Hang the engines off the wing, below the wing, have the struts, put the engines in pods. And so this was an invention. This was a moment of incredible brilliance. And so when he got back, again, they had the wind tunnel. They could fire up the tunnel and work on this right away. They took a little wooden model of a nacelle, put it on the end of a stick, and they put it in different places around the wing. They called it the broomstick test. And then discovered that the optimal placement was to put the engine forward and below the wing. And when you look at every jet we build today and every jet that Airbus builds, where are the engines? Forward and below the wing. This is where that was discovered. Ed Wells. It was just brilliant. And so, again, serendipity. It was just so many incredible moments came together for the development of this airplane. And here they are with all the wind tunnel models, very proudly showing that advancement through these different ideas till you finally get to an idea. And this is how airplanes are made at Boeing. What we start with will look completely different what we finish with. And this every time we make an airplane, we go through this process. So it just doesn't, we just don't automatically come up with a 777. There's a whole bunch of ideas behind it. So here's the mock-up that they created, and one of the final issues they had is with this very narrow fuselage, very narrow wings. There was no place to put landing gear. And so they had these, you can see in this picture how they had these this contraption where the landing gear would go way up and fold into the side of the fuselage over the bomb bay, because you couldn't interfere with the bomb bay. And so that was a big puzzle, but the folks over at Martin had figured it out. This was they did an experiment on this airplane they put tandem landing gear on it. It was on a B-26, the Middle River Stump Jumper they called it. And so that gave, well, the Air Force told Boeing, you need to do what Martin did with these tandem landing gear, and that answered that problem. So Boeing put together the airplane over at Old Plant 1 where the red barn used to be. And they flowed the fuselage, and this was the case for Boeing, is that the fuselage would be put on a barge. They'd float it up the river to Plant 2, and then into the old Plant 2 factory it went, and the airplane was finished. So 2 of these were built, these prototypes, at Plant 2 where the B-17s were built. And then it rolled out on September 12th, 1947, and at that moment, when the Air Force finally got to see it, there was so much excitement. They said, this airplane is a revolution. It is a revolutionary airplane. It is so unlike anything else that the Air Force was very pleased, although they didn't put it into production real quick either. There were some generals that needed to be taken for a ride in the airplane to really get excited about it, and then it went into production. But here to show how innovative Boeing was, here's what Martin was working on. See, they got the tandem landing gear, that was great, but straight wing with the engines buried in the wing. And so, of course, the XB-48 wasn't very successful. Convair had a very streamlined, that was a pretty airplane. But again, straight wing, engines buried in the wing. And just before the B-47 flew, Boeing flew an advanced version of the B-29 called the B-50. Later on, the last version of this, they built a handful of these, the TB-50Hs at Renton, and those ended up being the fastest piston airplane that Boeing ever built. It could, you can see there, it could go 418 miles an hour. Really, that's fast for a piston airplane. Right around the same time, Convair had come out with the B-36, so that was the heavy bomber of the period. 6 turning Fort Vernon. So that was our intercontinental bomber until the B-52 came out. And then the folks at Northrop stuck with Jack Northrop's very innovative flying wing. But you can see in this, even though it looks really futuristic and innovative, it's basically a straight wing, and it's a really thick airfoil, so that really limited the speed, so that's why it wasn't very successful.
Went fast, though.
Yeah, for 520 miles an hour, that's pretty fast.
Didn't it have CG problems?
It had terrible, pitch up, yeah. Well, and that's how they lost, was it Edwards, right? Isn't that the pilot Edwards got killed in that? Because of the pitch up.
I thought it got canceled because of politics.
There was that.
They wanted him to go with another company.
Yeah. Jack Northrop was always in the middle of something, poor guy, but that's why it was great. When the B-2 finally went into production, it was like his moment of triumph, and he got to see it. So that was a wonderful moment that Jack Northrop finally got his wish to see his flying wing, and I think he would be so excited to see the B-21, I think, right now. That's, just brilliant. Great story there. But one of the other things that Boeing did too was ensure that the B-47 could carry the atom bomb, and those other planes were not able to carry that. So that was a big plus for the B-47. So there it is. Boeing finally won that bomber competition, and the company was awarded contracts that kept the airplane in production for about 10 years, up to 1957. Over 2,000 were built. Douglas and Lockheed also built the airplane, so that whole sharing production that started in World War II, that continued. Yeah.
Is this guy rolling coal, or are those JATO packs?
Those are JATO. Yeah, that's quite the. I like to use this picture when we talk about sustainability today. And it's like, look how far we've come. Yeah, we instead of 6 engines and JATO tubes and all that smoke, and we now just have 2 big engines that are quiet and don't produce any smoke. Yeah, it's a very dramatic picture.
I think that's pictures of Moses Lake, and it got B-36s in the background there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's at, it might be Moses Lake, and it might be down at March, I think is where they where they had them first station. So, but you're right, that's where they did the flight testing at Moses Lake. So that's a great point. Yeah, and that's an old B model. What's that?
Was that a single pilot airplane?
It was 2 pilots. They set tandem, so pilot in front, co-pilot in back. So they kind of had that idea at the time that they would they thought bomber pilots would want to feel like fighter pilots. You know, and if you ever, Douglas had the Globemaster, was it the C-74, I think it was, when it first came out, it had 2 bubble canopies, so the pilots each had their own bubble. And the Air Force said, you know, this is bad because you can't cooperate. And so they did away with that and put the side-by-side seating. And the B-47 went on to do the world's very first jet-to-jet in-flight refueling, so something Boeing continues to do. So this airplane, see what that designed, the swept wings, the potted engines, and you look at all of the airplanes that are built today, this defined that basic concept, the optimal design of the subsonic jet. And we still follow today. That was 1947. Here we are today, still building airplanes like that. And you look back, this is a story about everyday people that got up in the morning, drank a cup of coffee, had their Cheerios, went down to work at Boeing and did something just incredible. It's just amazing. There's all these important moments when, and this is the thing about it, at any one of those key moments, it could have went off the rails, where it's like they'd run into a roadblock and then it would be months and months of research, and that never happened. So it's just amazing. And you really have to think that there's just maybe divine providence or something, but it's just such a wonderful story. So again, the legacy of the airplane, there you see how Airbus has benefited from all the work that Boeing did here.
Well, what do they have to lose?
Right, and of course that family of Boeing airplanes, all our great 7 Series airplanes, and yeah, there's that little imposter sitting in there too. That's 717. One of the other things that I want to point out about the brilliance of Ed Wells and that discovery of the potted engine, and this is one of the things I've been trying to, anytime I can talk to somebody in the media, I try to tell them this. Back in January, you remember on the news, there was this really dramatic pictures of a 747-8 freighter from Atlas Air, I think it was, going into Miami. It was dark, engine caught fire, really dramatic pictures of that. I looked at it and said, Ed Wells saved that airplane. That was exactly what Ed Wells had invented, was this whole idea of that engine being under the wing. If an engine caught fire, the airplane's fine. And so, but everybody, you know, of course, the media freaked out. You know, Boeing airplane's on fire. Oh my God! But it's like, no, this is one of the greatest safety innovations in history that Ed Wells discovered.
There's
So,
actually several instances of the engines actually coming off and saving the airplane.
yeah, and they're designed to do that too. The fuse pins on the engines, yeah. So just brilliant. And so, the final thing I want to say about this is that. In 1947, with the B-47 being such an incredible discovery, the company decided to create a new logo, a new trademark. And so they came up with this typeset with the letters angled. It's called Stratotype. And the Stratotype is 37.5 degrees to this day, because of the sweep of the B-47. So that Boeing, that name is from the B-47.
It's the world's fastest font.
It is, huh? That's great. And it's got some history. And here's the other thing too, that little squiggle next to it. So that comes from Douglas, and its heritage goes back 100 years right now. So 100 years ago, the Douglas World Cruisers made the first flight around the world. So that started, so we're celebrating that, started in April 1924, flew out of Sandpoint. Usually I'm down south, and I was like, Sandpoint's that way, not Sandpoint. Flew around the world, took 175 days, and there were 4 planes left Seattle. One of the planes crashed in Alaska, and the crew survived, but 3 planes finished the flight. Just an amazing story. These guys were really good pilots. I mean, it's just amazing. Open cockpit airplanes, and all they had was a compass, and you turn and bank altimeter, and they're flying through Alaska, the Bering Sea, through the deserts of northern India and the Middle East, and then across the North Atlantic where it was fog the whole way, and all of a sudden you get a break in the fog, and it's like, oh my God, there's an iceberg. You know, and it's such an amazing story. Anyway, so they made it back, and Don Douglas built those airplanes, and they were really good airplanes. And the technology was just right there. Don Douglas did a great job, and he had only started the company 2 years before that. And so all of a sudden he's a celebrity, and so he said, well, I'm going to take this moment and make a logo for my company. So he had a picture of the world with 3 little airplanes going around it. And over the years, that globe just became a circle, and those 3 little airplanes became a swoosh. And so our symbol, that's the Earth with those 3 airplanes going around it. That's a memorial to the world flight. So those 2 things actually mean something. It isn't just some crazy brand artist come up with an idea. They mean something from aviation history. So anyway, that's it. Thank you for letting me talk about airplanes. All right. Yeah. All right. Andrew, do you have...
What's your background and how did you get into this particular job, man?
I got lucky. No, I studied history, and like you, I love airplanes. I couldn't fly because I had bad eyes, but which are fine now, so I might fly. But I finally got them fixed. Took a long time. But you know, it's just I love airplanes and aviation history, and I started working at Boeing right out of high school. I worked in the mailroom while I was going to college and studied history, and then the manager I was working for one day, she came up to me and she says, Mike, you like airplanes a lot and you're good history. She says, you know, the Boeing archives, the folks running that, they've all retired and they're looking for somebody. You should go do that. And so, and I had to go and do an interview with the corporate vice president and all this, and I was just a kid, and it was like pretty intimidating. I must have done all right because they gave me the job. And so that was, so I've been at Boeing about 45 years and been doing this for about 30. So I was, you know, it's just a matter of it's not so much, it's not, it's what you know, the young people will ask me, especially, and it breaks my heart because the kids that are studying history, they're like, I want to get a job like yours, how do I do that? And it's like, you know, I was lucky. Yeah, I was just blessed. But the one thing I tell people, you work hard, do all that, but pay attention to those moments in your life that there are people that will come into your life and they will do something. There will be a moment, kind of like the B-47 story, where somebody will say something or offer you something or tell you something, and if you pay attention to it, it can change your life. So it's just those moments, those people that come into your life that do that, and that's been my experience. And that was one of the things that I learned is pay attention. Pay attention when those moments come, and seize the moment. Carpe diem, right?
Yeah, back in 70, 71, I was at Air Force in McCord. We had crypto maintenance at Boeing.
Yeah.
And that was the old Art Deco building. And as you went in, models of everything.
Yeah.
What happened to those?
We got, was that at the headquarters or you mean at Boeing Field? Yeah, so I think that was the original archives. And so all that, we're now down in Auburn. Everything we actually have a world-class facility. It's all climate controlled and sealed away, and so all those models are still preserved there as well. Yeah, along with what did my archivist tell me? We've got something like 100,000 photographs and 50,000 reels of motion picture films and videos. So we have the largest collection, video and photography collection of aviation history in the world. And like I said, we saved North American. I have all their stuff. Douglas, Howard Hughes, that's part of Boeing, Hughes aircraft. And so that's been a little harder. Howard Hughes hit everything. Bless his heart. So yeah, so that's so we've got an incredible collection, and we are working to get everything digitized so we can preserve it and share it.
Are those models up on display? Or?
And the models are. I've got this entire wall. It's like 100. What is it? Over 100 feet long, 6 shelves of models, and I don't know how many thousands we have. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And I am trying to work on getting someplace where we can get those out where people can see them. So, yeah.
Interesting. Since Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas, doesn't that make the DC-3 a Boeing?
It's what, now, so here's, it's part of our heritage, but it is not, it's a Douglas airplane, right? Don Douglas made that airplane, the Douglas people built it. It's part of our heritage, though. So that's what I tell people, when we talk about those airplanes, like the Mustang, it's the North American P-51 Mustang, or just Mustang, depending on who built it, but it's not the Boeing Mustang. And I am militant about that, because that's changing history, and that won't happen. It gets a little, and you get into that, okay, what version of the F-18 is a McDonnell Douglas and which one is a Boeing? There's you get a little dicey, because the Super Hornet is a Boeing airplane, but yeah. So, and that's how the Smithsonian, there in space folks, that's how they look at it too. Yeah. So, yeah.
You mentioned Airbus kind of following behind on the design.
Yeah.
So the Airbus A300, the first modded engine,
Yeah.
that they made, actually used the DC-10 modded engine design. They bought that design from Douglas.
Oh, is that right? It does look like it, huh? Now you mention it. Yeah, I didn't know that.
It's the same.
Huh? Yeah, it does. It very much looks like a DC-10. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. There's my thing I learned for today. Thank you.
Well, I worked at Douglas before.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Down in Long Beach?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always say, I think Don Douglas was the most brilliant leader and ran the best airplane company ever.
It was a great company.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm an old Boeing guy, but I'll tell you, Don Douglas, he was brilliant. Well, and he actually was. He was a genius. He was the chief, what was he? The chief engineer of the United States Signal Corps of the Air Force, and the chief engineer for Glenn Martin. And he went to MIT and did that first aeronautics program in just 2 years. And he did all that before he was in his mid-20s. Here he's the chief engineer of the Air Force, and he's this 20-some-year-old kid. He was brilliant. He ran a great company. Yeah. So thanks for working at Douglas. Yeah. Awesome. All right. All right.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.